Right. Hello, everyone. Good evening. My name is Kiah Morris, and I want to welcome you to our event today, Media Relations and Your Messaging, a question and answer with Zawadi Morris. So excited to have you all here tonight. I want to begin first by offering a land acknowledgement. We want to acknowledge today that we are gathered here on occupied Indigenous lands. Rights and Democracy acknowledges the Abenaki people as the traditional caretakers of Indakana, which includes parts of Vermont, New Hampshire, New England, and Quebec. As guests on the unceded territory of the Abenaki people, we pay our respects to their ancestors, elders, and relations past, present, and emerging. So hello, everyone. My name is Kiah Morris, and I am the Movement Politics Director for Rights and Democracy Vermont. It's my pleasure to welcome you again. So I know there's some folks that are new to Rights and Democracy on this call with us this evening. So I want to take a quick moment to welcome you and share a quick history about our organization. So Rights and Democracy and our sister organization, the Rights and Democracy Institute, which we call RAD or RDI for short, was founded in 2015 on the theory of change that it takes people power year after year to make the kind of big, bold, long-term changes that we want to see in this country. Now, part of the theory of change is that it takes political infrastructure, relational organizing, community engagement, and direct engagement to be able to change this world. Now, our members come from all walks of life. They're intergenerational, multicultural, they're activists, artists, organizers, but most importantly, passionate fighters for true social justice and meaningful change within our communities and across the state. Now, we have chapters in both Vermont and in New Hampshire, so look for us wherever you are. Now, I do want to share with you a very special announcement that we do have coming up this week for those of you who are early to our call, and we will put the information in the chat so that you can join us on this as well. So we have, as we're getting ready to turn a corner with the COVID pandemic, Congress prepares to roll out the latest relief package. We are so excited to be able to have a special town hall with Vermont Congressman Peter Welch that you'll be able to tune into on all of our social media channels. And that will be happening this Friday, March 5th at 4:30 p.m. So I do hope that you will join us for this important conversation, as all that we're talking about today leads into the future that we are trying to build tomorrow. So thank you so much for this. So now I would love to turn it over to Mia Schultz.
Hello, everyone. My name is Mia Schultz, and I am the Catalyst Leadership Coordinator for Rights and Democracy. As a community leader, I know well working with media and ensuring that respectful representation and coverage of our stories is not easy. Here's what we know. When the media gets our stories wrong, the effects on our communities are profound and often difficult to repair. When the images, sound bites, or framing of those placed in the media spotlight are not managed well or honored respectfully, our identities are marked in ways that uphold white supremacy and oppression against marginalized identities. We've seen this historically in media representations that present people of color as criminals, victims, or less than. More recently in Burlington, community leaders protested what was seen as an infantilizing, sexist, and paternalistic portrayal of a powerful movement against local law enforcement. And in January, hundreds of people across the state of Vermont signed an open letter criticizing the media for their racist and misogynistic portrayal of women leaders and the significant effects of that misrepresentation. For our community leaders, candidates, electeds, and more, building a better relationship with media and gaining knowledge and how to best work with the media is absolutely essential. In that spirit, it is my pleasure to welcome to our conversation today, Zawadi Morris. Ms. Morris is the founder and publisher of BK Reader, the first Black-owned and woman-owned digital daily news site in New York State. As a Chicago native, Ms. Morris attended the University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana, where she received her bachelor's in business administration, and a minor in Spanish. She received her master's degree in journalism from Northwestern University's Medill School of Journalism in 1994. Ms. Morris went on to work on Capitol Hill as a press secretary for New York Congresswoman Nydia Velasquez, and then for some years in healthcare communications. In 2000, she formed the Original Media Group, LLC, OMG, a bilingual media relations agency, MWBE, certified since 2006 to do business with the city of New York and New York. And in 2008, Ms. Morris served as a contributing reporter for the New York Times hyperlocal experiment, The Local, and then as an editor for AOL's Bed-Stuy Patch. And in 2013, Ms. Morris launched the Brooklyn Reader, a hyper-local digital daily news platform covering Central and East Brooklyn. Ms. Morris was named a 2015 Mover and Shaker in business by NV Magazine, and was part of the Goldman Sachs 10,000 Small Business Accelerator Program, and has been featured in Crain's Business New York. In 2020, Ms. Morris launched Scribe.org, a nonprofit collaborative news service and digital platform focused on hyperlocal investigative news in underserved communities. Ms. Morris is a member of the local independent online news publisher, Lion, and serves on the board of the Center for Black Literature and Studies. Woo! Thank you so much for joining us today. And the BK Reader is the only Black-owned and woman-owned newspaper in all of New York State, covering the borough of Brooklyn, New York, and an incredibly diverse community made up of many different communities with seemingly endless amount of unique and powerful stories. How would you, thank you. How would you describe BK Reader's approach to covering breaking news, community spotlights, and local issues that is distinctly different from any other media outlets like the New York Times, for example?
So hyperlocal news is probably the youngest and fastest emerging type of news coverage that we have today. And it's the result of there being so many voices and so many ways to access information. And what we do as a result when we're surrounded by a lot of information is we kind of close in to ourselves and look for ways to customize what comes to us. And that's where we see the outgrowth of things like Facebook and Instagram. Social media is a result of that. And in that same way, hyperlocal news is a way for people to filter out information so that it is customized to them. Hyperlocal is block by block community reporting, which is quite distinct from what we're used to having in the past. National news and legacy newspapers such as New York Times that cover cities. Now we're looking more at news outlets that are covering actual blocks. So we have in the past had community newspapers, of course, but now we're talking even more granular reporting. So if you, for instance, in Brooklyn, if there are helicopters that you hear at 2 o'clock in the morning flying over your head for an hour and you cannot sleep, the next morning you could pretty much log into a hyperlocal newspaper such as BK Reader to find out what was happening specifically on that block. And we also have geo tagging, so it allows you to search news by your zip code as well. So it's just a very much more concentrated and granular type of reporting. It also is in response to the ability for people to be able to blog now. And so actually we can credit blogging to hyperlocal news because people began around 2005, they began blogging what was happening on their block, and it started competing with the national newspapers. And so that is, hyperlocal is kind of a marriage between those two things. So yes, so to tell you how we're different, we are doing granular reporting that's up to the minute, and that is very specific to people and in their communities and neighborhoods.
So I appreciate that perspective. And when I think about that, it also, that granularity allows for an individual story and ways to boost stories that may not have traditionally been seen as newsworthy, but are deeply important for raising the profile of the experiences of individuals with marginalized identities and experiences. Well, so this is where it's interesting, because we're talking about hyperlocal and you're talking about the borough, you're talking about Brooklyn.
Yes.
Both Vermont and New Hampshire are small states, smaller than all of Brooklyn combined, okay, between our two states and our population size. So as I'm thinking about this, how can individuals or organizations use that small scale of our local media to our advantage in telling our stories?
Well, first, I just want to, make it clear that hyperlocal reporting is extremely valuable for an organization or person if they're trying to establish themselves initially. We have it set up now so that we're followed by all the majors. They look for us to do the digging and find the diamonds, and they actually follow our reporting with bigger stories. So, I think a lot of times the misconception is that, oh, I don't want to start small. I want to go try to get into the bigger papers. But in actuality, starting with the hyperlocals is the best approach. I can't tell you how many of our stories have been picked up and, amplified because of what we've found at the more granular level. It's kind of made the bigger papers almost lazy in a sense, but they follow us, very closely. So hyperlocal reporting is really, really valuable in that sense. But to answer your question again, Kiah, and how, organizations can make themselves stand out on a hyperlocal level, I think it's important to understand that media right now is currently is very evolving. It's constantly changing, and it's a fluid platform. And so the way that you choose to communicate will have everything to do with what your particular platform looks like in your city or in your town. And so it's important to do sort of an evaluation of what does my media look like. So you're asking yourself, is my media how many media outlets exist? First of all, are you working with just one media outlet, or are you working with 10? Are the media outlets in general left-leaning? Are they right-leaning? Or are they somewhere in the middle? You want to understand what people's view of media is and if it has changed over time. And then also you have to be prepared to be nimble and change with whatever's going on. So I want to give an example like with newspapers. So as we started seeing this outgrowth of hyperlocal newspapers take place, like around 2005, 2010, what we also were experiencing was the fact that we had become a secondary source of information, meaning that people were no longer going to us as a first destination. Newspapers are not the first destination. They're no longer a place where people go immediately to. 75% of traffic is generated through social media. And that is continuing to build. Like every year, more and more people are getting their information and their stories through social media. And so because we have now become this kind of like the secondary platform as opposed to the first destination for people when they're looking for information, we've had to change our messaging and the way we message. Our platform now, our primary platform now is social media. So that meant that we had to clip our headlines, make sure that they were short so that the entire headline was able to fill up the box that you see on social media. The things that we had to consider all had to do with what our medium looked like. And so what I'm encouraging you to do is to understand where your audience is getting their information, first of all, and be prepared to tailor it to how they consume their information and where they get their information. And from there, you want to carve out your own space. And if you're part of a cause-related or action-oriented organization, I would suggest creating, number one, an expert profile. And that's where you position and is where your position and your expertise is clearly defined. So for example, an expert profile might include a position statement and a short bio on those who will serve as the media representative on topics, that they are professionals in. So when you see the same people over and over again, like on the CNNs, on the MSNBCs, or whatever news channel that you choose, those people have actually submitted an expert profile saying, oh, I can be a doctor that will speak on COVID, or I'm a doctor that can speak on cancer. So they're submitting their own profile of themselves as an expert. So that's one of the first things I would do if you're looking to carve out a space, is put together and submit an expert profile to both the print and digital and broadcast media. I would also suggest submitting regular op-eds, either through your own blogging platform, or you can ask up front whether or not they're interested in the op-eds, or you can do your own videos. So having something that's already pre-made and set up for them, and the easier you make it for them, the more likely they're going to pick it up and the more likely they're going to cover it. So taking your own lead in your own narrative is really, really key in establishing your presence.
I just love that you said that, because, you know, one of your first positions after college, I'm going to read as the press secretary for Nydia Velázquez, the first Puerto Rican to serve in Congress. As such, you had to manage the positioning and representation of the woman in both English and Spanish. So in this position, your job was to influence the media in the management of positive and potentially negative stories. What are some of the lessons you can tell that you learned and that you still use when engaging with elected officials through the BK Reader?
So thank you for that question. That's a very good question. So when it comes to crisis control or crisis management, they're very similar, but they're different, because crisis control really is once you're in the crisis. Crisis control is trying to get in front of the crisis, and crisis management is once you're in the crisis, what are you going to do if there's negative news out there about you? But what I want to say is, especially if you're working with a cause related, or if you're involved in something that has a political or social bend to it, that's polarizing or galvanizing, it's really important that you always be listening to the opposition. We kind of get stuck in our own bubbles. We often, feel it's so important to know what, where our immediate circle stands, which it is important, but we all of us have this tendency to kind of get stuck in our own heads and our own bubbles. And it's so important that you spend almost equally as much time listening to your opposition and what they're talking about. Not so much so that you're understanding them, but that you know where they're coming from, so that you can get in front of any potential negative messaging. So, I look at it as more as sort of playing chess and preempting people's moves. You always want to be listening to what the other side is talking about. That's the best way. And then once you understand how their narrative, differentiates from your own, be very, very clear about it. Then from there, that's the best way to manage your own messaging. You want to create a message that sort of speaks to whatever it is that they're saying that you do not agree with, or that you have opposition to. You want to basically come up with a statement ahead of time that is evidence-based and, not emotional. And the reason why I say evidence-based is because most people, especially when it comes to social issues, they move on emotion. But there's plenty of evidence actually to point to present your argument. And, as we all know, if you have evidence, which could be data in the form of numbers, which could be historical facts, if you lean on those things as opposed to how you feel about something or your moral compass, that is a much tighter sort of defense than, something that's emotional. So again, you want to listen to the opposition, get ahead of them, create your messaging early, and try as much as possible to make sure that it's evidence-based. So when I was working for Nydia, example of that, when I was working for Nydia, there was some controversy. She was a sophomore. It was her second year in Congress. I think she's now in her 12th or 13th term. but at the time she was still pretty new. And they actually carved out her district, and it crawled like a spider. If you saw the way her district looked, it was barely contiguous. Sometimes it was connected with what appeared to be like a thin line, which is a street, and it literally crawled across both Queens and Brooklyn and parts of the Lower East Side. It crawled across three boroughs, which is highly unusual when it comes to districting. But the reason why they did that is because, again, she was the first Puerto Rican congresswoman ever elected to the House of Representatives, and they were trying to provide a voice for the Puerto Rican and Latin community at that time, which there was not one. They had one in Harlem, Jose Serrano, and but they needed more representation. And so gerrymandering, in that instance became important and necessary. So then the conflict came, or the blowback came a couple of years later, when other districts that did not have an issue with representation also started gerrymandering their districts. As you know now, gerrymandering has become a very harmful for many communities of color and many underrepresented communities. So how are you, as an elected official, going to push back against something that you're the actual benefit and recipient of? And so this was a conversation that I was a part of early in my career and working in her office, and we had to come up with messaging for that. And so what we ended up just paring down to the basic facts. What was the reason why we needed to gerrymander her district in the first place? The reason was we were trying to provide an opportunity for equity for the underrepresented. We were trying to make sure that their voices were heard, versus what the other side was doing. They were gerrymandering for the purpose of propping up those who already were in a position of advantage and already had representation across the board. We were able to actually point to numbers and facts and historical data to show that there was this huge disparity. And so, again, there was a need on this end, but that did not make it justifiable to apply it on the other end. Sort of the same thing with affirmative action. A lot of times people are saying, well, why are you providing advantages for this particular group of people, but not, for those who are, what we called at the time the protected class, but then not for those who, already were having no problems getting into college, or having, no problems with their educational background. And so, again, this was a huge part of our messaging for that year. We spent a lot of time in crafting it. And so that's what we've continued to kind of fall back on. So, again, getting in front, listening to the opposition, understanding what might be coming in front of you, and trying to make sure that, it's evidence-based.
Wow, that's quite a story, and definitely something that we all feel, because we know that the positive press and the negative press can be changed in an instant, depending on where things are at, and especially within our social media culture, where everybody's an investigative journalist, and so they're going to go find whatever records and do FOIA requests like crazy to try to get information and build campaigns that are sometimes smear campaigns. So it's important for individuals and organizations to think about that. So really, thank you for that input. So so this is still a question. So we kind of are always taught, these are the ways that you get in the paper. You need to do a press release, and then you need to send a picture, and then you need to da, 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 da. And some of that works and some of that doesn't. You had mentioned some of the ways that you find stories as well. What are some ways that, if somebody wants to get coverage, the most effective ways to be able to try to do that?
So, this is where me being on both sides of the media really was to my advantage. As you know, I started out in PR, which is on this side of media, and now I'm a news publisher, which is this side. So having done both gave me so much insight in being able to really understand what it takes to pitch, and then also how a news person is receiving that pitch and what they would respond to. So, I can answer pretty definitively that question. So I look for two main things when I get a pitch across my desk. We get literally at least 100 pitches a day. literally, and I'm scanning them very, very quickly. And I may stop for one or two. And then those one or two get passed on to my managing editor. And then she makes a final decision whether or not she has the bandwidth, the room, the resources, all those things, the interest in covering. But the way I filter, there's two main things I do to filter whether or not something I find is newsworthy. And it's either the timeliness or is it helpful? Those are the two things I'm looking for. Is it timely? Does it make sense for what's going on in our world today? You know, is it around COVID vaccine? You know, is it around the distribution? Is it around, what are the things that are, you know, moving people right now, that matter to people right now? And that's timeliness. So if you're pitching yourself as a great violinist who just came up with this amazing composition that you want the world to hear, and it has nothing to do with what's going on in the world right now, you may be fantastic. You know, you may also merit coverage, but it's not going to be something that's going to be listened to because it has nothing to do, well, for me, it's not timely. It has nothing to do with what's going on in the world right now. And or is it helpful? Is it going to improve people's lives? Is it going to provide them with some information that's going to, you know, help with their childcare, help them be able to get, you know, fresher food to eat, you know, all those things. And that kind of goes back to timeliness too. But those two things are what I use to gauge whether or not I'm going to stop and read through a pitch. Self-promotional profiles, we still do look at those things. People like human interest stories. People like to still feel connected with their community members, but that's just lower on our list of priorities, especially right now that we're in a pandemic. So consider those things when you're crafting your pitch, is that you want it to, if you can craft it so that it resonates in both ways, that it's both timely and is helpful, what the work that you're doing is immediately helpful, that, you know, that'll put you closer to a home run. From a news perspective also, you know, what I teach my writers is that the three most important parts of a story is not what you would think it is. For me, well, the most important parts of the story, there's three things that are very, very important. The first most important part of the story is the headline. Okay. So the headline basically is telling you what you're about to read. The second most important thing is the photo. And the third most important part of the story is the lead. Those three things, especially since we're now in the age of social media, if you think about it, what is it that hooks you into a story as you're scanning all this information? Remember, we're having to make we're looking to make your voice heard through a chorus of millions. You want to first stand out. The headline has to really hook you. And then immediately your eyes go to the story. Is it a picture of a person that's doing something that's engaging, that is doing something interesting? Does the person look interesting? Is it something that moves you? And then the third thing, once you get past those two things, those are the two first gates. After those two gates, the person clicks the story, they're going to start reading it. They make a decision within about 20 to 30 seconds whether or not they're going to continue reading. And that decision is based around the lead. So the lead and usually the second paragraph. So I share all that to say that at the end of the day, press releases still work. You know, it may seem like an old form of communication with the media, but within the press release, you're able to accomplish those three things that we look for in putting together a story. You're able to create a headline, you're able to provide a photo, and you're able to also provide a lead. If the news editor feels that headline, that story, and that lead matches well with something that, you know, they can republish, you know, they're gonna continue reading on. So those three things serve a huge purpose, and that's why press releases still work. They still work for me. I actually prefer press releases to paragraph pitches. You know, a lot of times people think, oh, start out giving a human interest pitch, tell them about yourself and tell them where you're coming. No, just send me a press release. I want to see high up what's in the headline. And if you can, put the headline in the subject of your email. I want to see a photo. I want to see a couple of photos, actually. Show me a couple of photos within the body of the email. Don't send it as an attachment. And the press release should be well written so that the lead, you're basically giving me the lead in your press release. And then, it follows the same trajectory as a normal person would follow when they're deciding whether or not they're going to read a story, is what you're going to be considering when you're putting together a press release. So, so basically, and if you have quotes in there, even better. You'll find that some community papers, if they're short staffed, will literally run your entire press release as a story. We do not practice that. It's not considered good journalism at all, but it happens all the time, especially with community papers, print publications. They literally run entire press releases and photos if you include quotes. That's the best case scenario for you, is that you're going to want your pitch to actually be published precisely as you give it. A real journalist is going to actually call you up and interview you and ask a few questions, but that's how important a press release is. You want it to be written so that if need be, or if possible, it actually gets reprinted as is. So I hope that answered, did I answer your question?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. It's good to know press releases still work because I still send them. Thank you for that. Not all press is like press, in the more traditional sense. How can someone determine if a person asking for an interview is reputable? Especially with all these little nuanced sites and things like that.
Yes. Okay. So there's a couple of things that you can do. And I know that, our advertisers do this. I also do this because sometimes I get called in for press interviews as well. So there's a couple of things that you can do to determine that. The first is, I guess, which I would say is the most obvious, is actually go to the publication. Hopefully it's digital by now, and look at the stories. Look at the caliber of the stories. Look at how they're written. Are they well written? Are they researched? Are they balanced? Do they have more than one person that's quoted? Does it sound like a press release, or does it sound like an actually reported story? You can take a look, scan the site itself or scan the paper itself to get a sense of the caliber of that outlet. You can also tell the difference between a news outlet and a blog. There's a huge difference between the two, and that's not to diminish the importance of a blog, but news outlets have much wider crawl on Google than blogs do. The other thing you want to think about is how often are they publishing? Are you seeing the last two stories? Are they a week apart? Are they 2 weeks apart? Or are you seeing, a couple stories being published every day? For some people, it may not matter, because some outlets are weeklies, but you don't want to see, two stories, the last two stories publish a week apart, and there's only two stories. You want to, if you see something that's being published a week apart, you want to see, a good chunk, maybe a dozen stories in 1 week, another dozen stories the next week. So you look for those kind of things. How often are they publishing? There's some papers that I know of that skip literally weeks and weeks and weeks before they publish something again. That means that they're not, their distribution and their traffic is most likely very, very low. So you want to see regular publication. That tells you a little bit about how serious it is. The other thing, of course, I would do is check out their social media pages and look at the engagement on those pages, particularly on Twitter. Twitter is the site of choice for news readers and news writers. Twitter is where you see people engaging often and in huge volumes and quickly. So that's where you'll find the news readers, basically. And so look, in order of priority, I would say Twitter, Facebook, and then Instagram. Make sure that they have a presence on all three, but Twitter, in order of priority, Twitter is definitely number one. What's the chatter like? Well, how often are they posting on Twitter? Is there feedback on Twitter? Let me see. So another, oh yeah, I can't forget this one. Another good way to gauge is, so BK Reader is certified with Google News, and that certification came after about I think it was about 6 weeks. They spent about 6 to 8 weeks surveying your outlet to decide whether or not you're a blog or you're a news site, because there's a huge difference between the two. And so when we first applied for, acceptance into Google News, we were so anxious, we were biting our nails. They're looking at, again, some of the things that I just outlined. They're looking at the frequency of how our outlet was publishing. They were looking at the caliber of the news that we were publishing. They were looking at the feedback, and they were looking at our social pages. So after about 6 weeks after we applied, they accepted us into Google News. So now when you put in news in Brooklyn, we're amongst the Daily News, the New York Daily News, we're amongst the New York Times. You will never see a blog listed in a Google News search. And another easy way to find that out is if you go to google.com, they have tabs. Let me see if I can pull up what the different tabs are, but I know they have tabs. One tab is images, another tab is search, another tab is news. Click news, and once it's in that format, put in that outlet into the search box. And if that outlet comes up, that means that they've been certified through Google as a news platform. If it doesn't come up, that means it's not considered a news platform. So yeah, those are some of the ways that you can identify whether or not a source is reputable.
That's so good. That's so helpful, especially these days. And we don't want to say that we're trying to censor, First Amendment rights, but at the same time, we also want to be thoughtful about who we're engaging with and how they'll use that content or misuse that content, right?
Yeah.
So I would love and appreciate, I think this is an important question. Can we talk for a moment about, you'd mentioned within press releases, including images within the body of the press release, but can we talk about the literal images that are used in news stories a bit? So for many of our community leaders and those that are new to being in the press, the photos and even video clips that are often recycled within stories are not always flattering or relevant. And this isn't about a vanity play, but this is a recognition of the fact that photo imagery can influence the ways that a story is interpreted by a reader. So what are some tips for, again, literally controlling the images used in the story? I think about so many women that I know, Black women, women of color that have had, it's always a picture of them screaming and yelling or pointing a finger or in some kind of crazy expression when they have a whole litany of other photos that could be used or have been given permissions to use, but those aren't the ones that get used. Are there ways that we can better direct, please use these photos, or can we get you a better curation of photos that you're pulling from?
Okay, so I have some good news and bad news around that. That's a good question, Kiah. Thank you for that. So as far as whether we can control the images that come out in the media, I'm gonna say really no. Unless you are the event holder that is approving what press is there, really you cannot. If you are, you can have your media sign waivers about what type of images can go live, but really that is so discouraging for journalists. Journalists do not like that. They will blacklist you if you do that, unless you are the president of the United States or someone who definitely like a Beyonce or someone who people just want to have access to in terms of their images. You're not going to agree to something like that. So it's you have to keep in mind that if you're at an event where there is press and you are not a minor and you are not the one holding the event, then you are basically giving consent to be used by the press. And so then all assets, digital assets and otherwise, they all become public domain. Okay. So whatever you're doing in that scenario, if there's press there and you have consented to be there with press, whatever you're doing in that domain becomes, it's public domain. So in terms of getting in front of that, there's a couple of things that you can do. Like for instance, the elected officials do this. They have anyone that's in the media regularly, you have a set of approved photos that you make available on your website and in all of your media kits. And you try to make sure that those are circulated as much as possible. But I must say, those who choose to publish images that are not favorable or that present an alternate view of who that person is or what they want out there, that outlet that chooses to do that is going to look for that. They're going to do that. They're not going to be like, oh, let me go look for the approved images. They're actually seeking out that image. And You know, what I can say is just put us as much to balance that out, make sure you put out as much, as many images as possible that are favorable. But really all you're doing is you're kind of like, it's kind of like a push and pull situation. You're fighting up against, you know, First Amendment rights. And, you know, the downfall of being in the press, there's always that one downfall of, you know, the window of where you definitely can get negative press. There's nothing you can really do about it, to be honest with you. Unless you're a minor, then you can sue, or unless you took the photo and someone else is using it without your permission, and then in that right is copyright infringement. But outside of that, anytime that you are in a public domain where there is press and you've agreed to be there as a speaker or a participant, you are pretty much given consent to be covered. So
basically you need a handler to like make sure your hair's all right and like there's no lettuce in your teeth.
Put on some makeup, and when you're yelling and you're mad, still with a smile. Yeah.
Thank you so much. You know, I was thinking about that when, you know, there's things we can't control too, and how the social media comes into play with that. How can we best use social media to interact with the press? And how do you use social media to create create content in your work?
So social media is everything. I spent probably, after I launched BK Reader, I spent probably the first 2-3 years with a huge grudge against social media. Because social media has become the first gate to press coverage. And in that are a lot of pitfalls and harmful things that can happen for us as press. And also that's where you saw this outgrowth of what we call fake news as well. So it's a very toxic environment, social media is. So I was trying to avoid engaging with it until I finally came to understand that, you know, if you can't beat them, then you be them. So I try to see myself as a social media platform and try to design the way I work and the way I engage with my audience as a social media platform. You know, one of the lessons that I've learned probably as an independent media person in these last 10-15 years is that, you know, there's a lot that's going to be happening in the media because we have such a porous system of getting information out, and one that's not filtered and one that's, you know, not censored, that, you know, it's important to be nimble and to be ready to be creative and to be prepared. For me as a news platform, again, Twitter is king. Twitter is where those who are very heavy news readers, that's where they live and die. I'm more of an Instagram woman, but for news readers, Twitter is king. And so, you know, I would make sure that my presence on Twitter is very strong and is very engaged. People love to talk on Twitter. Of course, the use of hashtags is really, really important, because that's really how people navigate and drive on Twitter, is through hashtags. When they hear about something that's either trending, the first thing they do is hashtag it. They drop it into the search box as a hashtag, and they look to see what is the chatter around that particular topic. News organizations do the same. If we hear of something that's emerging, we drop it in as a hashtag and see who's talking about it. You know, you'll see, of course, first the people that you follow and those that follow you back, and what they're saying. So hopefully, you know, your Twitter account is tightly designed so that the people that you're engaging with are highly relevant to, you know, your subject matter or your organization. And so hashtags are extremely important, not only just for finding, but for being found. So like, for example, we cover 9 neighborhoods, and when we're looking and fishing for emerging news stories, we'll do a hashtag one of those neighborhoods. One of the neighborhoods is Bedford-Stuyvesant, another one's Crown Heights. Another neighborhood is Brownsville. So we might do a hashtag Brownsville to see what the chatter is around Brownsville. And, even putting in, even if it's not a hashtag, you still get, anytime the word Brownsville comes up, you'll still get, whatever tweet is mentioning the word Brownsville. So, hashtagging is really, really important, I would say. And that's basically how we fish for, both responses and for quotes in our stories. So make sure that your Twitter presence is strong, that you're engaging with others, and that you're being smart about your use of hashtags.
Thank you for that. I know I need to work on my hashtag game. I get kind of exhausted. Just like, I don't know.
There's so much social media. Let me tell you, this new relationship I have with social media, it's kind of like a fake marriage, because I'm just in it because I have to be and I have no other choice. But social media is a whole animal in of itself. It's like we need a whole department to understand how the changing algorithms and the changing people and all it's really there's a science and an art to it. And it's like the moment you finally decide to swallow it whole and just going ahead and dive in is going to be the best moment for you. You don't have to like it. You just have to understand it and figure out how to engage with it.
So real, so real. Well, so, and I appreciate that. And we did have a question in the chat that I think kind of flows with this. We talked about this a little bit earlier, but so where is the space for corrections or feedback on a story after it runs? Because there's sometimes where we'll think that you've done a really great interview and you're like, oh yeah, that reporter was hearing me. And then as the story runs, you're just like, oh, but you portrayed me as a victim, or you talked about this in a way that was not really what we'd meant. Is there a space and a place to not only provide corrections when they're factual, right, but then also to provide feedback as part of a relationship with the press?
So yes, there is. That's terrible when that happens. But it happens often where you don't get the story that you felt you gave. And this is where we have to understand that news is not something that is done in a vacuum. Not all journalists are created equal. Not all journalists want to be equal. Everything is subject to people's news is subjective to a person's own personal experience, unfortunately, and their own interests in the topic and their motivation for even covering it. And so in the front end, no, you can't control what comes out on the back end. Now, if there is something that's factually a news story, and as a news publisher, I know for a fact that you cannot change a quote or a statement or information that you gave in a story after it has published. If this is the information you gave, even if it was meant another way, if you said it, you cannot change it. The only thing you can change are factual incorrections. So if something's factually incorrect, you can request a correction. So for BK Reader, usually because we're a digital news source, if we get feedback within like 12 hours, we'll actually go into the story and change the story to reflect, accuracy. If it's more than 12 hours, like, around 24 hours or more, if it's been more than a day, then we actually submit a correction at the bottom of the story because it's actually been out there and circulated, too long to manipulate or change the story within. So, but what I would suggest is in terms of trying to guide or even push back on something that you feel was a negative depiction is to either ask whether or not they'll allow you to run an op-ed or a response. You also have the ability to leave a correction yourself in the comments. And that one hits hard because people love comments. People usually read comments. Sometimes they don't even finish the story and they go right to the comments. So you can set the record straight through your comment if there was something that's factually incorrect or something that was misrepresented. We personally cannot change comments, even if we don't like them, even if they're, dogging the paper. Sometimes we get negative, like, you guys are ridiculous, and we can't. We have to allow people to, sound off. If we have misinformation, like on Kwanzaa, our Kwanzaa posts, the candle was in the wrong, we put up a picture and the candle color was in the wrong position, and we had like 3 comments immediately. How can you write about Kwanzaa and you don't even know the position of the candles? And we're like, oh God. So we ran a correction with the correct photo depiction and apologized. So in general, papers, a reputable paper has to allow for comments and will not change it unless it's profanity and or something that's just, you know, highly argumentative. Also, you know, you have your own social media platforms to kind of speak out against that. And if it's something that you feel very strongly about that will impact the future, the view of how you feel people will be thinking about the organization or you or the event, if you feel very strongly about it, I would suggest that you do your own sort of you know, crisis management campaign through your own social media channels and set the record straight, because you know news can get recycled over and over again if something's wrong. So make sure that you respond swiftly and quickly if you're not satisfied with their response. Did I answer your question specifically? I don't know.
Yes, no, this has been amazing. It's just so wonderful. And I want to be thoughtful of everyone's time in this evening, and so grateful that we had the chance to have this incredible inside look. Your insight's been in your wisdom. Thank you. Thank you for your leadership. Thank you for the beautiful representation that you were doing for so many individuals across Brooklyn, and what that does and what that means for folks here to look up to and to hope for that type of continued positive coverage and lifting of our stories. Thank you so much. Everyone, you feel free, please go subscribe to BK Reader. You can find it on all the socials as well as at their website. So please be sure to go check that out and appreciate that hyper local important news cycle. I want to thank you all for joining us here at Rights and Democracy. Thank you, Mia Schultz. Welcome aboard. We're so excited to have her on here as we will be continuing to build out our programs. I want to thank each of you for tuning in tonight. Please don't forget to join us on Friday at what time is it? 4:30, 5:30? I'll know when I have to show up to connect up with Congressman Peter Welch and talk about our COVID, what we're dealing with right now with our COVID relief packages. These are important conversations and we're happy to have them with you. Thank you so, so much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful night.
Take care.